By 2019, the church had faded from public memory until a group of urban explorers decided to spend a night inside and film it for their YouTube channel. Their shaky footage captured only a few minutes of wandering through the nave before the camera began to distort. Faint murmurs could be heard, whispers too low to make out, but undeniably human. When the explorers returned to the basement, one of them claimed to hear children crying. They left in a panic, dropping their flashlight and leaving their gear behind. The video was uploaded a week later, quickly gaining millions of views and reigniting the town's old fears. Among the viewers was Claire Denton, a 35-year-old investigative journalist known for her work uncovering unsolved disappearances in small towns. She had grown up 2 counties away from Maple Hollow and vaguely remembered hearing about the church fire as a child. But what drew her attention was the sound in the explorer's video, those low, almost rhythmic whispers. Claire didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in stories that were buried and disguised as legends. And Maple Hollow seemed to hold one of those. Her investigation began with public records, but many documents had been sealed or destroyed. The official report on the fire was brief, mentioning an accidental blaze caused by faulty wiring. Yet the timeline made no sense. The fire department arrived more than 40 minutes after the call, even though the station was less than 2 miles away. 3 bodies were recovered, but several names in the attendance log were blacked out. There was also a handwritten note attached to the file, written by the church's last pastor, Father Elias Monroe. It read, "The voices are growing louder. I fear they are not from God." That single sentence changed everything for Claire. It wasn't the language of a man blaming coincidence or faulty wiring. It sounded like a confession, an acknowledgement of something he couldn't explain or control. That night, Claire booked a small motel room near the edge of town, her mind filled with questions. Outside her window, she could see the faint silhouette of St. Agatha's steeple rising through the trees, dark and still, like a sentinel guarding its secrets. She had no idea, then, that the truth waiting inside that church would cost her more than she could imagine. When Claire arrived in Maple Hollow the next morning, the town felt frozen in another time. Faded signs hung from the few surviving shops along Main Street, and every window seemed to hold a pair of cautious eyes. People recognized her type instantly, outsiders with questions. When she mentioned the church, conversations ended abruptly, smiles disappeared, and doors quietly closed. It was clear that St. Agatha's Hollow was not just a ruin. It was a wound the town refused to reopen. She began her investigation at the town library, a small brick building with dust-covered shelves and an elderly librarian who spoke in cautious whispers. Most of the old newspapers from the 1980s were missing, their microfilm copies damaged or removed. But one article, half torn and faded, caught Claire's attention. It mentioned a children's choir that performed at St. Agatha's just weeks before the fire. The choir had been made up mostly of orphans from the nearby Maple Home for Children, a place that, according to local records, had closed down abruptly around the same time. No official statement explained why. Curiosity led her to the orphanage site, a 10-minute drive from town. What remained was only a cracked foundation surrounded by weeds and broken glass. The building had been demolished years ago, leaving behind faint outlines of rooms. Claire noticed small things scattered in the dirt, a rusted cross pendant, a fragment of a child's shoe, a marble discolored by time. It didn't look like a place that had simply closed. It looked abandoned in a hurry. She photographed everything, knowing every detail might matter later. Back in town, she tracked down a former janitor who had worked at St. Agatha's before the fire. The man lived alone on the edge of Maple Hollow, his house filled with the scent of old wood and oil. His voice trembled when she mentioned the church. He spoke of strange events before the fire, unfamiliar visitors arriving late at night, the sound of chanting in the basement, and children crying when no one was there. He refused to say more and warned her not to dig deeper. His hands shook as he closed the door. That night, Claire returned to the church. The forest around it was eerily silent. Her flashlight cut through the dark as she stepped inside the main hall, the floorboards groaning under her weight. Dust hung in the air, and the smell of ash clung to everything. She studied the cracked walls, noticing something carved faintly into the wooden pews, circles intersected by crosses, drawn repeatedly, as if by an unsteady hand. They matched the symbol she had seen in the old church records. In the basement, she found what looked like a sealed doorway, hidden behind collapsed stone and rusted metal. It was secured with heavy chains, the lock fused shut. Someone had wanted it that way. When she held her recorder close to the door, the air grew colder. A faint whisper emerged from the darkness, soft, breathy, and distant. It wasn't wind. When she played it back later in her motel room, she froze. Amid the static, a voice, small, trembling, almost childlike, clearly said her name. Claire didn't sleep that night. The recording played over and over in her mind, the faint whisper of her own name tangled in static. She told herself it was interference, a trick of sound waves, or her imagination working against her. But something deep inside refused to accept that explanation. By morning, she had already made her decision. She needed someone to verify what she heard, someone who could strip away superstition and expose the truth buried in that building. She contacted Ethan Rowe, a sound engineer she had worked with before on a documentary about cold case confessions. He was skeptical but curious, known for debunking viral ghost footage using advanced acoustic analysis. When he arrived 2 days later, carrying a backpack full of equipment, he listened to her recording in silence. His brow furrowed slightly at the end, but he said nothing. By dusk, they were standing together outside St. Agatha's, the church rising before them like a monument to everything forgotten. They entered through the side door, its hinges screeching as if protesting their intrusion. Dust floated in the narrow beams of their flashlights. Ethan unpacked his microphones and sensors, placing them carefully along the pews and near the altar. Claire felt the temperature drop as they moved deeper inside. The silence was unnatural, so still that their own breathing sounded intrusive. When they reached the basement, the air thickened. The faint scent of burnt wood and damp stone clung to the walls. Ethan's instruments flickered erratically as he set up his recorder near the chain door Claire had discovered earlier. She began prying at the rusted links with a crowbar until one of them snapped loose. The metal door creaked open, releasing a wave of cold air that smelled of earth and iron. Beyond it stretched a narrow tunnel, barely high enough to walk through. Their flashlights illuminated the walls, revealing old scripture verses written in black paint that had begun to peel. The passage led to a small underground room. Melted candles surrounded a stone altar in the center, their wax hardened into pools. On the walls, faded newspaper clippings were glued haphazardly, headlines about missing children, each with a black and white photo beneath it. One name appeared repeatedly: Abigail Monroe, age 10. Ethan focused his microphone toward the altar, capturing faint fluctuations of sound too low for the human ear. Claire examined the altar closely and noticed dark stains in the stone crevices, aged, dried, and unmistakably organic. She felt an ache in her stomach as she pieced it together. These children had never simply disappeared. They had been brought here. When they returned to the surface, both were pale and shaken. That night, in her motel room, Ethan reviewed the recordings. Static filled most of the file, but then came the same faint whisper Claire had heard before, only this time clearer. It was a child's voice, trembling, almost pleading. 3 words repeated twice before the sound cut off completely. "We never left." Ethan looked at Claire, his hands cold, the color drained from his face. For the first time, he had no explanation. The next few days blurred together for Claire. She barely ate, barely slept, and spent every waking moment combing through records, transcripts, and any fragment of information tied to the missing children. The more she searched, the more the details refused to align. The Maple Hollow police had closed each disappearance with the same note: presumed runaway, no further investigation. But the children listed were all under 12 years old, too young to run, too young to vanish without someone noticing. Claire's instinct screamed that these cases were buried deliberately. Ethan tried to focus on the recordings, isolating frequencies and removing background interference. But every time he played the clip, he swore new sounds emerged, soft sobs, distant humming, even what seemed like faint laughter. He dismissed it as distortion, though his eyes told another story. The tension between them grew. Claire's obsession with finding answers was becoming dangerous, and Ethan knew it. Still, he stayed, maybe out of guilt, or maybe because the mystery had caught him too. Then, one night, Ethan vanished. He had gone back to the church alone after receiving a strange message from an unknown number. His text to Claire was short and cryptic. "They're calling again. I need to know what it is." The next morning, his car was found parked near the church, the driver's door open, engine still running. His camera was inside, mud streaked across the lens. The last few seconds of the footage showed Ethan walking into the basement tunnel, his flashlight flickering. A low humming grew louder until his breath quickened. Then the frame shook violently and cut to black. There was no trace of him afterward. Claire went straight to the police, but her report was dismissed as hysteria. The local officers barely glanced at the footage before labeling Ethan a missing person and closing her complaint. The same officer who filed the report advised her to leave town for her own safety. That warning only fueled her resolve. If Ethan was gone, she would finish what they started. Armed with a crowbar, flashlight, and recorder, Claire returned to St. Agatha's that night. The sky was moonless, the air heavy with mist. Every step toward the church felt slower than the last. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Her light swept across the pews, catching the reflection of something shiny wedged between the boards. A child's bracelet, caked with dust. She pocketed it and descended into the basement. The air was colder than before. She found the tunnel again, but this time the floor was marked with fresh footprints leading deeper inside. Her heart pounded as she followed them to a smaller chamber she hadn't noticed before. It looked like a room of remembrance. Tiny shoes were lined against the wall, old toys scattered across the floor, and faded photographs pinned in uneven rows. The faces of children smiled back at her through burned, yellowing paper. On the far wall, written in dark, flaking paint, were 4 chilling words, saved by his voice. The letters looked smeared, as if written by trembling hands. Claire stood frozen, realizing that whatever had happened inside St. Agatha's was not a haunting. It was a ritual, one that had never truly ended. 2 days later, Claire's car was found abandoned on a dirt road near the edge of Maple Hollow. The doors were locked, the keys still in the ignition, and her notebook set open on the passenger seat. Her phone was discovered in the glove compartment, containing a single unsent voice recording. The file was corrupted, but investigators claimed to hear faint echoes, what sounded like distant singing mixed with static. Claire Denton, the journalist who had chased the voices of St. Agatha's, had vanished without a trace. News of her disappearance spread quickly, but local authorities released only minimal information. To them, it was another case of an outsider who went too far into the town's cursed history. The church was sealed once again, this time under official order. For months, no one dared to approach it. But even sealed doors couldn't quiet the stories that began to spread. Stories of music drifting from the churchyard at night, of soft footsteps echoing through the forest, of a woman's silhouette standing by the ruined bell tower before dissolving into fog. Weeks later, a local pastor named Harold Mills was assigned to oversee the demolition of St. Agatha's. The church had long been considered unsafe, and after 2 disappearances tied to it, the council decided to erase it completely. On the morning of the demolition, Mills arrived early, stepping into the dim interior one last time. As he cleared some debris near the altar, a faint sound rose from beneath the floor, a soft hum, almost like a lullaby. He froze, listening closely. The melody was old, familiar. It matched the hymn once sung by the children's choir from the orphanage. The sound seemed to come from directly below the stone platform. When the demolition crew began their work later that week, one of the excavators hit something hard buried beneath the altar. Work stopped immediately. Beneath several layers of stone and earth lay a concealed vault. Inside were small wooden boxes stacked in a neat formation. There were 11 in total, their surfaces warped with age. Each contained the remains of a child. DNA tests later confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The bodies belonged to the missing children from 1987, including Abigail Monroe. The discovery shocked the entire county, but no living suspects were ever identified. Father Elias Monroe, the pastor who had served during the fire, had died years earlier under mysterious circumstances. His death ruled a heart attack. Investigators reopened the case, searching for connections between the orphanage, the church, and the strange writings found on the basement walls. They uncovered financial records suggesting the orphanage had been funded by private donors who disappeared after the fire. None of their names appeared in any official registry. Every trail led to a dead end. Months passed, and St. Agatha's was finally torn down. The land was left empty, fenced off and silent. Yet those who lived nearby claimed that on clear nights, they could still hear faint voices carried by the wind, a soft chorus of children singing beneath the earth. Some said they heard another voice among them, older, quieter, almost like a woman calling out for help. They believed it was Claire Denton, forever bound to the secret she uncovered, the final voice from the abandoned church.